Welcome back to AlgoJS. Today's question is LeetCode 8, string to integer. So we need to implement a function which converts a string to a 32-bit signed integer. And there are a few conditions that this algorithm must abide by. Firstly, we need to ignore any leading white spaces. Secondly, we need to check the first character if it's a negative or a positive, because this is going to determine the overall signage of the actual integer. And then we need to read through each character until we reach the next non-digit character or the end of the input. And then the rest of the string can be ignored. And as you can see, with these digits, we have 123, which goes to 123. We have 0032, which goes to 32. So we remove any lead-in zeros. Number 5, with the 32-bit signed integer, we need to make sure that we clamp the integer so that it remains within the range of -2 to the power of 31 to 2 to the power of 31 minus 1. And then we can just return the integer as the final result. So let's jump into the walkthrough. Okay, so this question is quite convoluted. There's a lot of wording involved within it. But what we need to do here is just break it down into a number of steps, because the main issue with this question is going to be the edge cases. So let's start off by breaking this down. So firstly, we need to remove leading white spaces. Secondly, we need to check the signage, right? Check, negative, positive. Then all we need to do is loop through the rest of the string until the next non-digit character or the end of the input is reached. So loop through integers within string. 4. At this point, we'll convert to negative based on 2. So based on point 2, whether we have a negative or a positive, we'll convert this number right here. And then lastly, we need to bind it to upper and lower. So as you can see, we've just broken this down into its incremental steps, and then we can loop through the string and work it out. So we're going to have an index, right? Which is going to start off at 0. Now, in order to remove the white spaces, we're just going to loop through this string, and we're going to check at each position within string whether we have a white space to begin with. And as soon as we don't have a white space, we can break from the loop, right? So we check at index 0, this is a white space. Index 1, this is a white space. Index 2, this is not a white space. So we can increment index to 2 here, right? So that's the first step done. Then we check to see whether this value that we're currently on is a negative or a positive. We have a negative here. So we can have an isNeg flag, and we can set this to true, because then we'll be using this in step 4. So we can tick that off too. So now we're on to step 3. We can update the index to 3 because that is the index we're on. Loop through the integers within the string. So what's the easiest way of checking whether these are integers or not? Well, we could have a dictionary of lowercase a to z, uppercase a to z, and all the special characters that aren't equal to integers, right? And we could have this as a string. And then if the index of this is -1, then we have found an integer, and we can add it to, say, a result string. Or a quicker method would be to use charcode at. So if we have s.charcode at, and we're at index, so just say this is I. So this is looking at the character code at the index of I. So at the index of I, we have a number of 4. So this is going to give us a number 52. Now, how can we use this? Well, the character code at a value of 0, so this is going to give us a value of 48. So if we use s.charcode at index of I minus 48, this is going to give us a value between 0 and 9 if the current index we're on is an integer. If it's not, it's going to be either less than 0 or greater than 9, in which case we can break from this. So that's what we're going to use at this point to check whether we have these integers, and we can populate this into a result string. So we have 42 here. So that's step 3 done. We convert to neg based on the value that we've got at 2. So at 2, we created the isNeg flag, which is set to true. So if it's true, then we just append minus sign, or we times by -1. So that's this step done. Finally, we need to bind by the upper and lower bounds. So the lower bound is -2 to the power of 31, and the upper bound is 2 to the power of 31 minus 1. So how can we bind to this? If we work out the minimum between the maximum value of -2 to the power of 31 minus 1 and res, this will make sure that it's always in bound of the maximum of 2 to the power of 31 minus 1. And let's say we call this minima. Then we work out the maximum between -2 to the power of 31 and minima. And this will always make sure that it is bound to this minimum. And then we can just return the results from this. And that will be the last step completed. And time complexity for this one is going to be O of n. So let's code this out. We need the index, which we're going to set at 0 to begin with. We're going to need an isNeg flag, which we can initially set to false. And we're going to have the result, which we'll end up returning at the end. And this will be set as an integer of 0. So firstly, we need to check and remove any leading white spaces. So if we loop through where I is equal to index and I is less than string length, so we're going to loop through the string. If s at I is equal to an empty string, then we can increment the index. Else, if we don't find a white space, we can break from this. So that's checking for white spaces resolved. Now we need to check for the signage. So if s at index is equal to a negative, or s at index is equal to positive, so isNeg can be set if s at index is equal to a negative, right? So if it's negative, isNeg will be set to true here. And then we can increment the index. Now we need to loop through the characters within the string and determine whether they're an integer or not. So we're going to loop through where I is equal to index, and we're going to loop through the string. And this is where we're going to use character code at. So the num is going to be equal to s shellcode at I minus 48. So if it's an integer, this will always produce a value between 0 and 9. So if we have a num which is less than 0 or a num which is greater than 9, we know that it's not an integer, so we can just break from this. Otherwise, we're going to times res by 10, and this is that we move to the right of the integer. And then we're just going to add on the number to res. Now we just check the isNeg flag and update res accordingly. And the last step for this is to bind the result to the maximum and minimum. So let's say the minimum is equal to minus 2 to the power of 31. The maximum is equal to 2 to the power of 31 minus 1. Then we'll work out the minimum, which is math.min, and we'll get the minimum between the maximum and the result that we created. This will bind it to the maximum, and then to bind it to the minimum, we're going to choose the maximum between the minimum which we just created and the min. And then we can return this and check if this has worked. Submit it. And there you go. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.